Hello, this is Alan Brooks, and today we're going to be talking how Bible experts and scholars get caught up in some details of one word and they assign whole new meanings to chapters and paragraphs that they should not have. An example of this is found in Luke 21 compared with Matthew 24 and Mark 13. And we're going to look at how Bible experts get schizophrenic, or they suffer from schizophrenia. Instead of being honest about what the Bible says, they get really weird and they assign whole new meanings to chapters. Luke 21 is the story of the disciples asking Jesus, what's going to happen at the end of time? And Jesus gave the normal signs that we all have seen in Matthew 24 and Mark 13, which are parallel stories. And he goes, people are going to say, I am the Christ. But don't go after them, the false Christ. That's verse 8. Then verse 9, he goes, you're going to hear wars and commotions, but don't be terrified, for these things must come to pass first, but the end will not come immediately or just yet. Then he said to them in verse 10, Luke 21, nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There's going to be great earthquakes and famines, verse 11. But before all these things, they're going to persecute you and hate you, delivering you to synagogues and prison. And in history, that actually did happen. The early disciples of Christ were delivered and killed by the Romans. So anyway, these are the normal signs that we see in Matthew 24. It has the same story. The disciples asked Jesus, hey, Jesus, what are the signs of your coming and the end of the age? And he told them the same list of signs. And in Mark 13, it's a virtually identical list, the same list. It's going to be people are going to say, I am the Christ, follow me. But, it's a false Christ. Don't follow them, Jesus said. And there's going to be lots of wars, and nations will rise against nations, and great earthquakes and all that stuff. But the seminal event that starts the end of time is in Matthew 24, verse 15. And what is that event, you might ask? Well, we've all heard about the Great Tribulation, or the Tribulation, which is the last 7 years. That's mentioned once in Daniel 9:27. And there it basically says there's going to be one final 7-year period, starting by a peace treaty or an agreement. But in the middle of that 7-year period, the Antichrist will come into Jerusalem and stop the sacrifices. He'll proclaim himself God in the temple. It's an event called the Abomination. And when does that happen? In the middle of the last 7 years. And this starts the real Great Tribulation, or the last 42 months, or the last 1,260 days in some places in the Bible, or the last 3.5 years. It starts when Antichrist and his armies invade Jerusalem and stop the sacrifice. Now, Jesus spoke about it this last 3.5 years, and the rest of the Bible speaks of this time about 15 times. Now, what's interesting about that is this 7-year tribulation that most of us have been taught is only mentioned once in Daniel 9:27. But the 3.5-year period is the real focal point. That's the time when the Antichrist invades and stops the sacrifice, like I just said. So in Matthew 24, it goes, when you see this abomination of desolation, this is Jesus, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, which, as I said, Daniel repeats this prediction of the Antichrist performing this abomination. And Jesus says, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, that's verse 15 of Matthew 24. Then verse 16, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who are on the housetop not go down to take anything out of his house. And basically what Jesus is saying is, when you see this Antichrist, which I believe is a Muslim and Muslim armies, you better get out of town fast, dog. You better, get out of the inner city hood, because that place is going to be destroyed by these Muslim armies. And we used to wonder when I was growing up, why did Jesus say this? Why would Jesus say get out of town fast? Well, it has come to light recently. Why? Because Muslims hate the Jews. Muslims would kill even pregnant women. They would rip them open. Hosea 13 says that. It says the infants will be killed. The pregnant woman will be ripped open. And in fact, ISIS has actually done that. And so this makes sense in the light of the current information as what Muslims will do. They'll come in Jerusalem, and Jesus said, don't even get your stuff out of your house, but get out of town really fast. Why? Because Muslims will kill Jewish women and kill children and kill everybody. They hate the Jews. That is a current law of today in the Muslim community. They want first and foremost to destroy Israel, to invade Israel and take back Israel for themselves, and along at the same time they want to kill every Jew. So you can see how the current headlines match what Jesus said here in Matthew 24. He said, when you see this Antichrist performing the abomination, flee, get out of town. And so this really is a different aspect, a different interpretation from what most people are taught. Most people are taught that the Antichrist is some sort of peaceful Messiah, maybe a Jewish person, maybe the Pope, and he'll come into Jerusalem and he'll waltz into the temple all nice-like as a wonderful human being, a glorious false Messiah, and then all of a sudden he'll turn into this evil person, the Antichrist. Well, is that what the Bible really teaches? No, and I'm going to show you why in just a moment. But first, I wanted you to see that Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21 are all almost 100% the same, with almost 100% the same words and phrases. But in Luke 21, it says something really interesting. After being the same everywhere, the different place is right where I read you just now in Matthew about when you see the abomination, flee. Well, Luke is different. He says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, know that its desolation is near. Well, Matthew said, Jesus said, when you see the abomination of desolation, that same word, flee, get out of town. And Luke said, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, know that its desolation is near. Then verse 21, Jesus said, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who are in the midst of her depart, and let not those who are in the country enter her. For these are the days of vengeance, that are all things that are written may be fulfilled. Verse 22. So it's different in this one place only. But what's weird about Bible scholars, they take what's written in the next few verses and they say, hey, this applies to AD 70, while Matthew 24 and Mark 13 apply to the future. Gee, isn't that wonderful? Like I said, it's like if there are 4 stories about the feeding of the 5,000, and if there's a subtle word shift in one of them, and I said to you, well, this doesn't mean the feeding of the 5,000, this means something happened 2,000 years ago, you'd think I was crazy. So why am I saying this? Because all 3 places in the Bible that talks about the end of time, the disciples basically said, what are the signs of your coming? And Jesus lists all the signs. And at this seminal point, at the start of this last 3.5-year time frame, or the Great Tribulation as it's called, in Matthew and in Mark, Jesus says, when you see the abomination of desolation, flee, get out of town. And Luke says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, flee, get out of town. And verse 22 says, these are the days of vengeance, that all things may be fulfilled. Verse 23, but woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing babies in those days, for there'll be great distress in the land and wrath upon this people. Well, this is pretty much what Jesus said in Matthew and Mark. He goes, again, woe to those who are pregnant. And he goes, this is the time of great distress. So again, this is pretty much exactly like Matthew and Mark, except for that one place, verse 20, where it says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies. And then let's go back to verse 24. He goes, they will fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive into all nations. And Jerusalem will be trampled by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. So you can see how these experts and scholars for all time have got, it says they'll be led away captive into all nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled by the Gentiles. Oh, what am I going to say? Light bulb over my head, the experts say. They were led away captive in AD 70 when the Romans came in and trashed Jerusalem. That must be about then, because, we're going to take this one place, this one scripture, in the midst of a matching chapter that matches end times, and say that applied to 2,000 years ago. Now I ask you, does that make logical sense? No, because the entire picture of the Bible that the people miss is that the Antichrist will lead an army. He'll come in, he'll be a Muslim from northeast of Israel. He'll come in and he'll thrash Jerusalem. That's why it's called the abomination of desolation, or the NIV, I believe, says the abomination that causes desolation, because That's what the Antichrist will do. And of course, that makes perfectly logical sense in the light of today's reality. The Muslims hate Jerusalem. They'd come in and thrash the city. They would destroy the Jewish homes. And that's why Jesus said, flee really fast. Don't even go down in your house and get your stuff, because you better get out of there, because Jerusalem is surrounded by armies. And then verse 22, it says in Luke 21, though these are the days of vengeance, that all things may be written, may be fulfilled, that were written, and woe to those who are pregnant. Again, that's the same thing Jesus said in the other two chapters, Mark 13 and Matthew 24. For there'll be great distress. And Jesus said in Mark 13 and Matthew 24, this is the time of great distress, or great tribulation, which is why the last 3.5 years is called the Great Tribulation. Gee, am I being too logical here? But verse 24, again, is the big key that the Bible experts become schizophrenic. And they go, they will fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive into all nations. And Jerusalem will be trampled by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. So they go, aha, that must mean AD 70. But could it mean the future? Since everything else in this chapter matches almost 100% the future chapters of Matthew 24 and Mark 13. Yes, it has to be for the future. I think Jerusalem will at some point will be surrounded by armies, and that will cause its desolation when the Muslims flood through and cause the people of Israel to flee. And it says here, they'll fall by the edge of the sword, verse 24, Luke 21, and they'll be led away captive, which makes sense. There's many places in the Old Testament that talk about this event where the Antichrist comes into Jerusalem and he leads away the leaders of Jerusalem and Israel captive. And then it says Jerusalem will be trampled by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Now, there's an amazing verse about the same time period in Revelation 11:2. It says, the Gentiles will trample Jerusalem for 42 months, or the Great Tribulation. So here it says the Gentiles will trample Jerusalem until the times of the Gentiles were fulfilled. So I ask you, that's Luke 21, verse 24. Were the times of the Gentiles fulfilled in AD 70? Heck no, people. No way. When will they be fulfilled? At the end of the tribulation, when Jesus Christ comes back and he destroys this Antichrist who is invaded with his armies. And that's why Joel 2:20 says, I will cast out the northern army from you when Jesus Christ comes back. Anyway, that's a side issue. But getting back to Luke 21, it goes, Jerusalem will be trampled by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles will be fulfilled. And then Revelation 11:2 matches that. John says there, the Gentiles will trample, same word, same people, Jerusalem for the last 3.5 years or 42 months. So doesn't that make more sense? It's all one story about the end of time. Now, Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. And so because someone says, aha, scattered, and the people of Jerusalem will be scattered, that means AD 70, when everything else in Luke 21 is about the end of time. And it pretty much matches Matthew 24 and Mark 13. So this is the days of the vengeance. Jesus said flee here, which is the same word throughout the entire Bible. When this Antichrist invades Israel, flee. Flee to the mountains. It says that in Ezekiel 7. It says that in very many places on Isaiah, perhaps 20 different places. It says that over and over in the Gospels. When you see the abomination, which is code speak for the Antichrist coming into Jerusalem, flee. And I think even Daniel says this. He goes, when the Antichrist comes in and performs the abomination and stops the sacrifice, Israel flee. And then getting back to Luke 21 here, he goes, there'll be great distress in the land and wrath against these people. Now why? Why would there be wrath against the people? Is God mad at Israel? Well, I found that unfortunately, as much as I love Israel, at the end of time, God will be mad at Israel for some reason. It says they go after other gods many times in Isaiah and other places. But I think the seminal reason, the main reason that God might be mad at Israel is because they're going to rebuild a temple and start sacrificing again when, hey, God has given his only son once and for all. Now that might make God a little peeved at his people. And so that's what we see. It says this is the time of wrath and vengeance. This is the days of vengeance upon Jerusalem, verse 22, and that all things which are written may be fulfilled. So let me ask you, schizophrenic experts, were all things fulfilled that were written in days of vengeance in AD 70? No way, Jose. No way. This has to be a parallel verse with the verses in Matthew 24 and Luke 13, that Israel will be invaded. Israel flees from the armies, and that makes sense too. So why would people flee if it's just an Antichrist, Pope-like figure strolling through the streets of Jerusalem, da-da-da-da-da-da-da, and then he comes into the temple, and all of a sudden he becomes the Antichrist? Now, why would people have to flee from that? Well, here Luke 21 gives you the reason why. It's not a guy just strolling through and suddenly turning into some beast character. It's armies. It's armies that come into Israel, and they destroy Israel, which is why it's called the desolation, the abomination of desolation. It's the desolation of Israel, and it happens during peace, because the first 3.5 years of the last 7 years is a peace treaty, right? And Paul said the day of the Lord, which I believe starts with this invasion by the Antichrist and his armies, happens when people say peace, and it's a destruction. A destruction where? Israel. That's the seminal message of the entire Old Testament prophetic works, is that on the day of the Lord, there's going to be an invasion of a peaceful Israel. Israel will have to flee to the mountains, and then 3.5 years later, Jesus Christ will come back. And for that last 3.5 years, the Antichrist, who is a Gentile, who Ezekiel 7 says is the worst of the Gentiles, will come in and invade Israel and trample her. So that's my main point here, is that you have to, it's called hermeneutics, which is the study of how the Bible verses fit together, which means you can't take a story about the feeding of the 5,000 and say it's the story of Jesus healing the little girl. They're two different stories, and you have to keep things in context. Well, Luke 21 is word for word the same as Matthew 24 and Mark 13, the two other places that talk about the second coming of Christ, except for this one place that starts the 3.5 years, the last 3.5 years, where the Gentiles are trampling Jerusalem. It starts with this invasion of a Jerusalem surrounded by armies, and that's why Jesus said flee. You don't flee from an Antichrist coming into the temple. You flee from an army, a Muslim army. Now, doesn't that make a lot more sense? So please don't be sidetracked by expert, scholar, smart people who get their microscopes out and focus on one word where it says Jerusalem here will be trampled and they'll be led away captive. And they say, oh, the captives, that happened in AD 70. And thus I will ignore every other word around this particular scripture, which says, these are the days of vengeance, that all things that were written may be fulfilled. What I found in the study of the Old Testament is that all these prophets repeat the same message, which is at the end of time, on the day of the Lord, God's going to be mad at his people. He's going to send an army to burn Jerusalem and make it a desolate city. And it says that he's the worst of the Gentiles. He's Gog. He's the guy who all prophets have spoken of in Ezekiel 38. He's going to come into a peaceful Israel. So that's all I wanted to say today, to make it short, is that the Bible is filled with the same story maybe 100 times. It's the story of the last 3.5 years, where an army comes against Jerusalem. The people have to flee really fast because it's a Muslim army who will kill pregnant women, which makes perfect sense in regard to what Jesus said. He goes, woe to those who are pregnant. You know, the Vatican, if the Pope is the Antichrist, he wouldn't want to rip open pregnant women, would he? No, he wouldn't. So that's all I have to say today. Read things in context. Keep things biblically sound. Don't leave out scriptures. Read them all in context, for they all say the same thing. At the end of time, there's one last 3.5 year period. It starts with this invasion by these Muslim armies. It lasts 42 months, where the Gentiles will be trampling Jerusalem until the time of the Gentiles is fulfilled. And it specifically says that's 3.5 years, Revelation 11:2. Voila, it's perfectly sense. And so that's called biblical hermeneutics, where you keep things in context and they make sense. Now, doesn't this make a lot more sense? It's not monsterneutics, like the scholars try to do who are schizophrenic in their asylums. Let's keep it real, people. This is real. This is the truth. This is the way it is according to all three places: Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. And after this 3.5-year period, what happens? Well, all three places say Jesus Christ comes back. He takes care of this Antichrist. In one place in Isaiah, he goes, he kicks him like a ball into another country. He's really mad at this guy who came in and, he destroyed Israel. He desolated his people. Anyway, this is Alan Brooks signing off. If you've got any questions about any of this, you can email me at abrook8, no S, the number 8, abrook8@aol.com. I'll be glad to answer any end-time question. Thank you very much.